Chapter 8. Every Man a Tiger. The small town of Las Vegas, Nevada, had grown in size by late September 1952. When it was founded in 1905, there were less than 800 residents. Currently, there were about 25,000 people living in this thriving little city. Those in the gambling industry had already established a foothold several years earlier, and were quickly adding more hotel casinos along the two-lane highway that led into Las Vegas from Los Angeles. Some of the more notable ones were the Flamingo, the Desert Inn, and the Frontier. Construction on the Sands Hotel had just begun. Smaller hotels, motels, and a few wedding chapels were also prominent along this route. When Jim first arrived, he thought about going to a casino and dropping a few coins in some of the slot machines, but then decided against it. He wasn't much of a gambler anyway. He got there late and just wanted to find a cheap place to bed down for the night. Besides, enough risks were already involved flying jets, and he would in fact be laying all his cards on the table over the next several months. Jim had to get up early the next morning to report to Nellis Air Force Base, which had a stern reputation of either making or breaking potential fighter pilots. Nellis was known to produce some of the best fighter pilots in the world, but originally the base was designed as a training ground for aerial gunners, those boys manning the machine guns in the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, with only a thin slice of sheet metal between them and an enemy fighter. The base opened on January 2, 1941, when the city of Las Vegas bought an old airstrip run by Western Air Express on property 8 miles northeast of downtown. The city leased it 3 days later to the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, which was looking for a place to establish an aerial gunnery school for the Army Air Corps. The city had hoped to use the airstrip for both civilian and military use, but that plan didn't work out. In March 1941, construction began on what would become Las Vegas Army Airfield. 2 months later, the base welcomed its first commander, Colonel Martinez Stenseth, who set up temporary headquarters in the basement of the Las Vegas post office until the field was completed. The training was set to begin in September 1941, but didn't get underway until shortly after the war started. In January 1942, using makeshift equipment, the training began with machine guns mounted on the backs of trucks, shooting at targets that were placed on railroad cars to simulate firing at moving airplanes. Later in the year, the trucks were replaced with real bombers, allowing the gunners to shoot from the inside of an actual turret. The gunners were also trucked over to Indian Springs, where they would climb into the backseat of an AT-6. After reaching the proper altitude, the gunners would stand up in the back and shoot at a fabric target that was towed by another airplane. The methods used to train these guys were a bit archaic, but they worked nonetheless. By the end of 1942, over 9,000 aerial gunners had graduated from the school, leaving for destinations in Europe or the Pacific. In 1943 and 1944, during the height of the war, the training had picked up so much that over 15,000 men and women were stationed at the field. Most of the training during these years involved B-17 gunners, but included some B-24 and B-26 gunners as well. Then, in early 1945, the focus shifted to training gunners who were going to fly in B-29 Super Fortresses. By the time the war ended, over 45,000 B-17 and 3,000 B-29 gunners had trained at Las Vegas Army Airfield. In September 1945, the gunnery school there closed down and the base itself was deactivated less than 2 years later. The newly formed U.S. Air Force then reactivated the field at Las Vegas Air Force Base in March 1948 and organized a single-engine pilot training school there. On May 2, 1949, the base hosted its first national gunnery meet, with 14 Air Force units flying in from around the country. Flying both propeller-driven and jet aircraft, the pilots from each fighter group competed in 6 events: air-to-air gunnery at 10,000 feet, air-to-air gunnery at 20,000 feet, rocket firing, strafing, dive bombing, and skip bombing. The winner of this first aerial competition was the 332nd Fighter Group Tuskegee Airmen, based at Lockbourne Air Force Base in Ohio. A month before the gunnery meet, the Air Force had initiated its memorial program for the sole purpose of honoring selected individuals who distinguished themselves while serving their country. Recommendations came pouring in from citizens all across America who thought certain deceased airmen had distinguished themselves to the extent that they should be honored by having military air bases named after them. Local civic organizations in Las Vegas unanimously chose First Lieutenant William H. Nellis, an Army Air Force fighter pilot who lost his life on December 27, 1944. Lieutenant Nellis, a 1936 graduate of Las Vegas High School, was a member of the 513th Fighter Squadron, 406th Fighter Group, and flew a P-47D Thunderbolt in support of General Patton's Third Army during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 27th, he was flying over Luxembourg, providing ground support for the 101st Airborne Division, when he spotted a German convoy on the road below and started down after it. While strafing the convoy, Lieutenant Nellis was hit by small arms fire, causing his plane to burst into flames and plummet to the ground. On April 30, 1950, in honor of Lieutenant Nellis's service to his country, Las Vegas Air Force Base was renamed Nellis Air Force Base. Shortly after the Korean War began, Nellis Air Force Base began its conversion from a single-engine pilot training school to a combat gunnery school for fighter pilots. At first, F-51 Mustangs were used in practicing both air-to-air and air-to-ground tactics. Later, F-80s and F-86s were brought in for these tasks. Primarily, Nellis had the responsibility of producing combat-ready F-86 Sabre pilots for assignment in Korea. On February 1, 1951, Luke Air Force Base, about 20 miles west of Phoenix, Arizona, was reactivated and started churning out F-84 pilots who were going to Korea. Throughout the rest of the war, Nellis and Luke Air Force Bases alone would supply the entire inventory of fighter pilots to the Air Force. As Jim arrived at Nellis to begin his combat training, his confidence level was soaring owing to the fact that he had graduated from single-engine pilot school near the top of his class. But he knew that flying at Nellis was going to be a unique experience. From all the stories Jim had heard about Nellis back at Webb, he hoped he would score high enough while staying alive at the same time. There was even an adage being passed around the various single-engine pilot schools that basically said, if you can survive Nellis, then Korea should be no problem. This saying became clear for one of Jim's former 52F classmates who had been assigned to Nellis. When Second Lieutenant Robert J. Bob Holland, who was in Dixie Flight at Webb, first arrived and was checking into his room at the Bachelor Officers' Quarters, he saw something going on in the room next door, a scene that he soon learned occurred frequently at Nellis. He noticed that someone was gathering the personal effects of the occupant of the room and was told that 4 guys had been killed the week before because of target fixation, mid-air collisions, and other mishaps. The flying that took place while these guys were cadets had been mild compared to Nellis. Accidents had occurred at some of the different training bases, including a few fatal ones, such as what happened to Charles Barfield at Webb. But Nellis was the big time, and it didn't take long before they found this out directly. During their initial briefing in the base auditorium, the new pilots arriving at Nellis were welcomed by Colonel Clay Tice, Jr., the commanding officer of the 3595th Flying Training Group. He had been a former P-38 fighter pilot who led the 49th Fighter Group during the latter part of World War II. Colonel Tice was well known for his straightforward approach and overly aggressive leadership style that personified the training program at Nellis. At the briefing, Colonel Tice gave his classic speech. He said, "Welcome to Nellis Air Force Base, men, the finest fighter weapons school in the world. We're going to do one of 3 things to you here: wash you out, kill you, or make you one of the best fighter pilots in the world. The choice is yours." These guys quickly learned that training at Nellis was going to be hard-hitting, relentless, and with no room for errors. To prove this point, the motto of the 3595th Flying Training Group was "Every man a tiger," and Colonel Tice even had his personal F-86 adorned with this animal, and the motto written underneath. The gun panel on the left side of the fuselage had multiple rows of painted red stars, along with the words, "Over 500 MiGs destroyed by Nellis-trained pilots." The idea was to form an aggressive attitude among the new pilots, not letting them get slack in performing the proper maneuvers and tactics. After all, this wasn't single-engine pilot school anymore. It was combat training. Every battle condition was presented on the desert ranges to give these guys a realistic scenario of what they might experience when they got to Korea. Many times, the new pilots would even engage in rat races when they tried to outmaneuver each other as in a dogfight. There were many occasions, especially while flying F-80s out to the bombing range, when aggressor pilots flying F-86 Sabres would swoop down from above, creating a swirl of activity. A lot of times when this happened, too much fuel was burned up while getting away, and the pilots in the F-80s had to return to base without releasing a single practice bomb on the range. But again, this was Nellis. The instructors were some of the best in the Air Force. Most of them had combat experience in Korea, with a few having fought also during World War II. Their message to the students was simple. They said, "Anytime you are in the air at Nellis, you are fair game for anyone." And they backed this up with liberal bounces anywhere and any time. Even while on a bombing or strafing mission, a pilot had to be constantly looking over his shoulder. The instructors who flew these aggressor aircraft kept their gun cameras on at all times, and if any one of them came back with a pilot's tail number on his gun camera film, then he was in big trouble. Some of the instructors were aces, having been assigned to Nellis to sharpen the skills of these untrained fighter pilots. A couple notable ones were Major Frederick C. Boots Blessé, with 10 MiGs to his credit, and Captain Ivan C. Kincheloe Jr. with 5. Blessé arrived at Nellis in December, 2 months after Jim began his training. He started out as an instructor, but later moved up to be one of the squadron commanders. Captain Kincheloe arrived in early 1953 during the second phase of training when these guys were flying F-86s in multiple training exercises. These young pilots looked up to all these combat veterans with total admiration, absorbing every word that was spoken and trying to emulate their talent out on the range. The 3595th Flying Training Group had 6 squadrons attached. During the first phase of combat training while flying F-80s, Jim was assigned to the 3594th Training Squadron. Some of the other pilots in the squadron included guys who knew Jim from Webb, like classmates Chuck Parrott and Oscar T. Brooks. Another member of this close-knit group was James C. Setterberg, a 52F graduate from Bryan Air Force Base in Texas. Since the F-80 was similar to the T-33 flown at their training bases, there wasn't a problem getting adjusted to its many quirks. Going out to the range and dive bombing with this aircraft was a pleasure for all of them, even though its design was getting obsolete. Nevertheless, the newer F-80C models, which had been used in Korea ever since the war started, were still being flown by some of the fighter-bomber squadrons over there. Although the program at Nellis was set to make their combat situations as realistic as possible, the one big difference between the pilots dive bombing on the desert range at Nellis and those doing it in Korea was that nobody was shooting back at them from the ground at Nellis. If that scenario could have been played out, then probably more pilot deaths would have transpired, because one of the major causes of accidents on the bombing range was a situation known as target fixation. After a pilot began his dive bombing run, he would line up a specific target on the ground with his gun sight, and when the two matched, he pickled off his small practice bombs, then recovered from the dive. But if the pilot got distracted somehow, the target would never line up with the gun sight, and he usually ended up plowing his aircraft into the ground while still trying to get them to match. Reports of this fixation happening to some fighter-bomber pilots in Korea were common. Whenever these accidents occurred on the bombing range, it was just considered one of the hazards of the job. For example, when a pilot was out flying on the high-angle bombing range one day, he heard the ground controller call, "Swordfish Lead, what's that column of black smoke?" Swordfish Lead replied, "Oh, that was my number 4 man. I lost him on the last pass." The ground controller then came back, "Unscorable at 12. Unfortunately, there weren't any second chances for these pilots to get it done right. No flight simulators existed for the pilots to safely learn dive bombing techniques on the ground. All the training took place in real fighters, and not much time was given to actually get the feel of a specific aircraft. This was because a pilot took off in whatever plane he was assigned. Training at Nellis was considered on-the-job training, and a pilot either made it through the program or he didn't, one way or another. Jim never seemed to have any problems with the pressure exerted by the instructors at Nellis. In fact, he thrived on it. Most of the guys who trained with him felt the same way, but for some pilots who were well versed in this tiger tradition, being a fighter pilot meant more than just dive bombing or firing machine guns at a rag target. It was the way he lived. With the Las Vegas Strip only a few miles away, these young fighter pilots constantly felt the pressure to be able to party all night at the casinos, then report back early the next morning to the flight line without any adverse effects from the night before. Most of them were successful in tempering their nightly activities, but others learned the hard way, sometimes fatally. One such pilot was Donald E. Heyer, a newly commissioned second lieutenant from Springfield, Minnesota, who was a cadet in Class 52F. After Heyer graduated from advanced training at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona, he came to Nellis with the expectation of becoming a great fighter pilot. During his free time at night, as many of the new pilots did, he would occasionally drive to the casinos in Las Vegas, have a few drinks, see some shows, maybe do a little gambling, then come back to the base and get some much-needed sleep. But on one particular Thursday afternoon, after getting only a few hours' sleep the previous 3 nights, Heyer was scheduled to qualify for skip bombing with his flight. This involved putting a practice bomb through a 10-foot square canvas target that was placed on the ground, and he needed to fly his F-80 low to the ground to make a successful hit. Sam Jackson, the former student officer who helped one of Jim's classmates back at Columbus Air Force Base, was also on this flight. He was in Heyer's flight at Williams and was assigned to his squadron at Nellis. According to Jackson, this bombing run was going to be tricky. The manual said not to get lower than 50 feet over the desert, but after you had missed a few times, they would clue you in. If you dropped from higher than the target, the bomb would bounce or skip over the target instead of going through it. Therefore, we learned that you had to get below 10 feet to drop and hit. Heyer was number 2, and I was number 4 in the racetrack pattern, and we were flying at better than 400 miles per hour. His first try was a skip over, with a reminder from our instructor that tigers got low. I could tell from his radio transmission that Heyer was determined, that there was no way his next bomb would go over the target again. I watched as he very smoothly put his aircraft right through the middle of the target and into the ground on his last pass. I figured that he had about 6 hours total sleep all week. Halfway into their training program at Nellis, the accidents still occurred, but they became less frequent over time, owing to more stringent flying safety regulations. At this stage, the pilots were introduced to the F-86 Sabre for the first time. Jim had hoped this moment would arrive ever since he had been at Columbus. When he was at Webb, he got the opportunity to look inside the cockpit of an F-86 as it sat on the flight line getting refueled. But to actually fly one was something else entirely. For all these pilots, it was like getting to drive the hottest sports car, only this one had swept wings and was powered by a high-performance jet engine. The Sabres they flew were mostly A models. The F-86A was the first production model built by North American Aviation. Its swept-wing design was the byproduct of German studies and wind tunnel tests on swept-wing designs of the Me-262. The North American Aviation engineers used the captured German data and then made some refinements of their own. This resulted in the F-86A having a 35-degree swept wing with leading-edge slats for low-speed stability. Because of its high speed, it was one of the first production aircraft to have an ejection seat. The F-86 Sabre had a bubble canopy similar to the P-51D Mustang, and the instrument panel, though similar to the Mustangs, was more complicated. Besides the standard flight instruments that showed speed, altitude, and attitude, it was laid out like most jets. Instruments were added for exhaust gas temperature, outside air temperature, and a G-meter for showing the pilot how much stress was being placed on his aircraft during high-speed maneuvers. Later on, the pilots sometimes got the opportunity to fly the F-86E, which was different than the F-86A in that it had an artificial feel to the controls. It had full hydraulic power-operated flight controls that gave the pilot better maneuverability throughout all the different speed ranges. To go along with this new system, the F-86E had an all-flying tail. In other words, instead of just the elevators on the horizontal stabilizer moving when a pilot pulled forward or back on the stick, the leading edge of the stabilizer moved. During the time Jim was at Nellis, the pilots flying F-86Es in Korea were the ones shooting down most of the MiGs. In both air-to-air and ground support training missions, the F-86 Sabres at Nellis were not only capable of firing at targets with their .50 caliber machine guns or dropping practice bombs, but these aircraft could also carry up to 16 5-inch high-velocity aerial rockets to be used against various targets on the desert range. In all of these roles, flying the F-86 was a thrill for Jim because he was able to go on these types of practice missions not long after he checked out in one. The Sabre was a much different handling aircraft as compared to the F-80. It was much smoother on the controls and easier to land. Also, learning to fly in formation was easier in the F-86, although it took constant practice to get it right. While flying to the range and back, the pilots would practice what was called the Fluid 4 tactical formation. In a 4-ship flight, the second element, numbers 3 and 4, flew slightly behind, out from, and above the lead element. This high element formation was designed to give maximum protection to the primary shooter. In combat, the flight leader was the primary shooter if any MiGs attacked. His wingman, number 2, had the responsibility of keeping him clear while he was maneuvering or shooting. The element flying above could then dive on the attacking MiGs, providing mutual support to the lead element. If the flight split up, then the element leader or number 3 man would get to do some shooting while protected by his wingman. Learning how to properly fly this Fluid 4 formation was critical if these pilots, especially the ones sent to fighter interceptor squadrons, were going to be successful when they got to Korea. At Nellis, a pilot was fortunate if he got assigned to a squadron that had an instructor who knew every facet of the aircraft's capabilities. Jim was sent to the 3525th Combat Crew Training Squadron during this phase of training, and was taught by an experienced combat pilot who knew the Sabre inside and out. A few of his classmates even had the privilege of being tutored by some of the best instructors on the base. Robert Holland was assigned to the 3596th Cadillac Squadron. The commander was Major William T. Bill Wisner, an ace in both World War II and Korea. The first time Holland checked out in an F-86, the routine was fairly casual. I just looked at the manual, then listened to a short briefing by my instructor on this flight, Ivan Kincheloe, who always had a huge cigar in his mouth while he stuck his head in my cockpit. He said, "You'll like it, kid." I then took off, wings waggling all over the place, with Kincheloe following in another F-86 to keep me out of trouble. It was exciting, to say the least. The F-86 Sabre was the hottest jet fighter in the world, and I was going to be an F-86 pilot. After his initial ride, Holland started to go on some training missions out to the bombing range. One day, while heading out there early in the morning, his instructor wanted to read below sea level on his altimeter. So, off we went to Death Valley, a few feet above the dirt, on our way to the practice bombing range, Holland recalled. We barely cleared the roof of Scotty's castle as we proceeded on our way. I was number 4 and burning up more fuel than anyone else trying to stay in position. Approaching Indian Springs on our way back, I was down to the Texaco low fuel point. I called, "Texaco!" No response. I called again, and my flight leader simply said, "I heard you, now stay in position and shut up." I remember passing over Las Vegas and seeing 0 on my fuel gauge. I was petrified, expecting to flame out at any moment, but I didn't. I flew that airplane again on the next mission. As I approached the cockpit, the crew chief calmly said, "Lieutenant, do you know how much fuel we put in your airplane yesterday? It was 435 gallons. It was an F-86A, and I think that was the maximum internal fuel capacity. I had pulled into the chocks on fumes. I told this to my flight leader, and his only comment was, "Nice fuel utilization." Out of all the instructors at Nellis, Ivan Kincheloe was perhaps the most intriguing, and there was no doubt he had the attitude of a fighter pilot. One evening in the officers' club, Kincheloe was having an exceptionally good time when a bird colonel ordered him to tone it down a bit. Kincheloe just turned around and told this colonel where he could go and what he could do with himself. Snapping back at a senior officer wasn't exactly normal protocol, but Kincheloe was an ace, and the colonel was only a ground pounder, which really meant nothing to the pilots at Nellis. The colonel got angry and threatened to take disciplinary action, but nothing ever happened. Later that evening, the pilots in the squadron got to watch one of Kincheloe's gun camera footage from Korea. They sat there totally amazed as a huge tailpipe filled the entire screen. Then, about 3 seconds later, they saw pieces of a MiG-15 spraying in all directions. Getting the opportunity to shoot down a MiG-15 someday provided one of the strongest motivations for these pilots going through the program at Nellis. What they learned would soon prove invaluable when they got to their assignments in Korea. They came to Nellis Air Force Base as proven jet pilots, confident in their abilities, and secure in the knowledge that if they did well, they would leave as combat-ready fighter pilots. So far, one half of the adage had been completed. They survived Nellis. Hopefully for them, the other half would as well.